Hello, welcome to the second part of Legends and Lattes. I really do hope you enjoy this one. I know I did say that we would be doing 6 chapters, but I didn't realize it'd take me 40 minutes to do two. So I guess we're going to be breaking into 2 parts, like 2 chapter parts, or however long it takes me to read. For 45 minutes, because I don't want to do 3-hour readings. Let us begin. So we last left off when Viv had hired the one dude she found at the dock, Cal, to help rebuild her little cafe that she's trying to create. So we're going to begin on chapter 3. Let's begin. True to his word, Cal arrived with the dawn. Viv had placed the track crate out in front and was sitting and watching the shadows take shape in the morning sun, contemplating how excellently a mug of coffee would suit her. The hob hauled in his box of tools and placed it inside his big doorway. "Morning," she said. He said, but he nodded genially enough. He removed his copy of the materials list from a pocket and unfolded it. "Lots to do. Some of this will have directly. Some will take time." Viv produced her purse. Her platinum and most of her sovereigns were in the lockbox, but she figured there was sufficient funds to cover what she needed. She tossed it to Cal. "I think I can trust you a place with the orders if you're willing." Cal looked surprised. He sucked his teeth thoughtfully for a moment before saying, "I reckon you'll not get the best prices if I'm the one dickering." "Think it'll go better if it's me?" Her smile was sardonic. "Well, maybe it's a wash, and you want to trust me with all of this? Don't fret. I'll stroll away with it." He bounced the purse in his hand. She gave him a long look, and her expression didn't lapse. "No," he said as he took in the size and shape of her. "No, I suppose you wouldn't." Viv sighed. "I've lived a long time knowing that I'm a threat walking. Or that wasn't a shape of it for you." He nodded and tucked the purse away. "I'll need some hours." Viv stood and stretched, knuckling the ache in her lower back. It was always stiff in the cold. "I need to rent a cart. Something to haul the junk with. And some place to haul it." "The mill for the cart," said Cal. "Figured you can find it. As for the rest, there's a min out west and off the main road. Cart tracks hook south. Thanks. I'll be off then." Cal tipped his cap and ambled back down the street. He was right. The mill was indeed willing to rent her a cart. Less a pair of animals for full silver, which was certainly more than it was worth. The miller grinned smugly after she paid, no doubt imagining the trouble an orc would face hitching up a horse. But she gripped the traces in both hands, lifted, easily got the cart moving by herself. The miller watched her roll away. Scratched the back of her bald head amusedly. Viv worked up a healthy sweat and loosened herself up on the trip back. Along the way, she haggled with the stonemason, who had 3 or 4 ladders at a job site. He parted with one for 10 coppers too many, and she tossed it in the back of the cart. Lena was back on her porch, broom in hand, tacking what Viv had to imagine was the cleanest stoop in the entire territory. She gave her a neighborly nod and began the hard work of clearing out the old building. It quickly became apparent exactly how much junk had accrued in this place. Rotten lumber, horseshoe iron, and a set of rusted and bent pitchforks. A baled stack of grain sacks, crumpled tack, an assortment of saddle blankets thickened with mold, and plenty of awkward, cumbersome, and decrepit miscellany. The office had its own shivered breeze, moth-eaten ledgers, shattered inkwells, an inexplicable set of winter undercloths gone grey with dust. Viv snapped the broken ladder, threw it in the cart, set up the new one, and climbed to the loft. Thankfully, there was only a little old hay, the pigeon's nest, and a few scraps of this and that. Black blood lay there in the dust, already gathering some itself. She picked it up, hefted it in her hands for a second, and then leaned it carefully against the slanted ceiling. By noon, the cart was piled high. Filth covered Viv from head to toe, and the livery's interior looked like a sandstorm had passed through it, with little dunes and drifts of dirt having resettled after the disturbance. She thought with amusement that she should hire Lainey to broom it out, but when she looked in that direction, the old woman was absent. There was, however, someone else shadowing her own doorway. Viv's back prickled with a sense of trustful implicity. It was the reason she was still moving around and breathing, after all. "Help you with something?" she asked, dusting off her hands and thinking about Blackbud leading it up to the loft, out of reach. He was dressed stylishly with a ruffled shirt, a vest, and a broad-brimmed hat. But on closer inspection, his clothing was worse for wear, sweat-stained and little frayed. His skin had the grey cast of one of the stone fae, and his features were sharp. "Oh, no help required," he replied, We like to welcome budding entrepreneurs to the city when we can, and I'm powerfully curious about what the new business you'll bring to the district." His voice was smooth, almost cultured. Viv didn't miss the reference to the nebulous we. "Oh, so you're a city official," Viv smiled. This time she didn't concern herself with how prominent her lower fangs were. She approached him so that their difference in stature was even more apparent. She was pretty sure she knew exactly what this man was, and until recently, she'd have had him by the throat and off the ground already. He didn't adjust his posture, Iota, smiling back, "Not as much. I just consider it my civic duty to welcome new arrivals and take an interest in their welfare." "I'll consider myself welcome then. I didn't catch your name." "You didn't, but fair exchange is no robbery." "Didn't catch yours either." "Indeed, I don't suppose you'd mind giving me a little preview of your new—" He looked around, heard the cart, and waved a gloved hand. "Venture?" "Trade secret. Oh, well, I want to pry." I'm glad to hear that. Viv walked back to grab the traces and lifted, her biceps punching as she started hauling. It was significantly heavier than it had been that morning. Her lower back lit up in a bright knot of pain. She didn't slow as she approached the door, staring grimly past her visitor, who at the last second had to depart the threshold less gracefully than he would have doubtless preferred. "We'll catch up later," he called after her as she rumbled the cart down the cobbles to the west, her face set, breathing hard through her nose. Above, the clouds began to clot and thicken, threatening rain. Everyone else on the street made certain they were clear of the coming storm. When Cal reappeared that afternoon, the sky was even darker. Viv was seated out in the tack box. The cart returned, her sleeves were rolled up, and sweat stripped the grime on her arms. As the hob approached, Viv saw a bundle under his arm. When he stopped, he flapped a corner of it at her. "Tarpaulin. Looked like rain. Best we keep the new lumber dry." He tossed her purse to her, and she tucked it away without bothering to examine it. Viv hauled out the ladder and gathered a few stones from an alley. They both climbed under the roof and anchored the tarp, with the stones over the hole. Just as raindrops began to speckle the tile a dusty orange. When they were back down and inside, listening to the drops clatter lightly overhead, Cal said, "Well, maybe no deliveries today, unless the rain slacks off." He looked around the barren interior. "A good job of it, eh? Looks a fair bit bigger now." Viv smiled ruefully as she surveyed the place. The emptiness of it somehow made the work to come more daunting. "Think I'm a fool?" Cal shrugged. "Not in the habit of offering my less than positive thoughts to somebody like you." "Somebody like me," she sighed. I mean somebody who's paying." He gave her one of his thin smiles. "Well, as the one paying, I don't see a reason for you to wait around here a while." She was interrupted by the arrival of the cart with 3 small, sturdy crates in the back. "That's promptness for you, Cal." Viv headed out into the rain. "That's not the supplies," she called over her shoulder. She had already caught the smell of it, signing for the delivery. Viv paid the driver and declined his help hauling the crates one by one into delivery. Each was tidily assembled with the sides and base cleverly fitted and only the top nailed in place. Gnomish stencils ran along the panels at neat right angles. Cal watched curiously as Viv gently set down the last one, then indicated Cal's toolbox, giving him a questioning look. "Have at it," he said. Hefting a pry bar, she levered the lid, and there inside was a set of muslin sacks. The scent was even stronger now. Viv shivered in anticipation. Untying one, she dug a hand to it and let the roasted brown beads sift through her fingers. She loved the quiet hiss they made as they fell back into the bag. You're right. Not much like tea." Emerging from her reverie, Viv glanced up at him. "You can smell it, though, can't you? Like roasted nuts and fruit." Cal squinted at her. "Though you said you drank it." Viv nibbled one, experimentally, tasted the warm, bitter, dark flavors that coated her tongue. She felt she needed to explain. "They grind it into a powder and then run hot water through it. But there's no more to it than that. When the machine shows up, I'll show you. Gods, the smell of it, Cal. This is just a ghost of it." She sat back on the flagstones and rolled the bean between her thumb and forefinger. "I told you I came across in Azimuth, and I remember following the smell to the shop. They called it a cafe. People just sat around drinking it from these little ceramic cups, and I had to try it, and it was like drinking the feeling of being peaceful. Being peaceful in your mind. Well, not if you have too much, then it's something else. A lot of folks allow you to feel peaceful after a beer. It's different. I don't know if I can tell you how it is. Well, all right then." His look was not unkind. "In the interest of your new business, I guess I'll say I hope folks have the same experience you did." "So do I." She retied the sack, took his mallet, and started nailing the crate lid back down. When she looked up again, Cal was emerging from the office area. He stopped in front of her and stared at the floor, ruminantly for a second, and she was content to wait for what he had to say. Figure you might need a sort of kitchen back there, stove, maybe a water barrel, and some copper pipe, hooks for pots and pans. The water barrel is not a bad idea. I should have thought of that, since I need the water. But a kitchen? What do I need that for? Well, he said, looking apologetic, if you find nobody wants any of the beans and water, at least you can feed 'em. As the day drew down, the rain stopped and the city smelled of not clean, then at least refreshed. It wasn't quite dusk, but Viv took her lantern and her notes out to the track box, which had cemented its role as her porch bench, before she could settle into the re-examine them. She spied Laney across the way, wrapped in a shawl and blowing on a mug of tea. Viv set the lantern on the box, tucked away her notes, and stepped over to the drying puddles to join the woman on her porch. Evening, she said. It is, Laney nodded at delivery. Seems you've been mighty busy, miss. She grinned slyly when she said it. Oh yeah, I suppose so. Sleeping in there, are you? Hope you're locking up at night, dear. It's close to the high street, but I wouldn't like to see you running afoul of smut unsavory after dark. Viv couldn't mask her surprise. As a rule, folks spared little thought of her physical well-being, including herself. She was touched. Don't worry, locked up tight. But speaking of anyone unsavory, Viv tried to sort out what she wanted to ask. Had a visitor today, big hat. She held her hands out wide from her head. Fancy shirt, stone fay, I think, you know him. Laney snorted and slurped her tea. She said nothing for a long moment and sighed. One of the Madrigals, I reckon. The Madrigal, huh? Some kind of local kingpin? Bunch of stray dogs, spat Laney. The Madrigal's got the leash, her wrinkles bunched tight around her mouth. But the Madrigal ain't to be ignored. When they ask you to pay, she gazed sharply at Viv. And they will ask, you best bank your coals and pay. I'm not sure I can bring myself to do that, she replied mildly. Laney patted Viv's considerable form. I know you may have thought till now. Seems to me you ain't here to do what you've always done. Am I wrong? The old woman had startled her again. Well, that's true, Viv said. Still for that, not sure I can. Roll over to a little man in a big hat and a silly shirt. Laney chuckled darkly. Never mind the man in the hat. The Madrigal's what you want to worry about, and nothing silly about them. I'll be careful, said Viv. They stood in companionable silence for a few minutes. Viv glanced sidelong at Laney's mug of tea. Say, you ever have coffee? Laney blinked at her and looked affronted. Why, I never have. In the way I was brought up, a lady doesn't talk about her maladies, she said primly. Viv barked a laugh, to the old woman's great annoyance. Viv moved her bedroll and lantern to the loft under the slope of the roof. The smell of coffee beans filtered up through the cracks in the boards, and she inhaled it deeply like a warm earth memory. This tarpaulin thumped like a distant drum in the occasional gust of wind. In the lantern's light, black blood gleamed where it leaned. Against the wall, Viv stared at it for a long time and thought about the man in the hat and the Madrigal. She felt a sudden impulse to sleep next to the blade as she had 100 campsites by a vox. She deliberately turned away, extinguished the lantern, and filled her lungs with the dark smell from below. On the roof, there was a solid thud, followed by rhythmic, heavy padding and scratching clatter on the tiles. But she was already beginning to doze. She lost it in the sound of the tarpaulin. Then she was asleep. Interesting. Chapter 4. The lumber tiles and other supplies came in piecemeal over the next few days. Showers came and went. Then the sky cleared entirely. When it did, Viv and Cal repaired the hole in the roof, shucking old tiles down through the gap to shatter on the floor. She was surprised at how many of the timbers they had to take up to mend it fully. Cal was just as methodical and mindful about the repair work she'd hoped. It was a hard 2 days of labor for the both of them, but the roof was fully proof against the water again. Next, Cal examined the interiors, sounding the boards with a knuckle, several times digging his fist full of dry rotten wood out and shaking his head at it. After 4 days of prying out old timber and nailing in fresh, they started to wonder if they might have been better off rebuilding the whole damn thing. She rented the cot from the miller again in the hallway of the debris. They built a permanent, sturdier ladder to the loft. It was fast study and a reasonable hand with a hammer and nails. Accurately slinging a slab of metal and striking a target was squarely within the realm of her abilities. When Cal first clambered onto the loft and spied black blood glimmering darkly in the corner, he made no comment on it. "Cozy," he said instead. "You wantin' a bed and dresser, no doubt?" "No need," said Viv. "I'm used to sleeping rough." "Used to same ain't the same as ought to." But he pressed no further, and that was that. The main stable area, they did as Cal had suggested, cutting down the stall walls, converting each into a sort of booth. The hob boxed in neat U-benches along the interiors. They pre-assembled tabletops, and Viv easily orc-handled them into place across trestles. Viv cut 2 high windows into the northern and eastern walls, letting the morning sun crawl down from the loft and into the new dining area. They sanded the office counter and added a hinge extension to the end of the extra workspace. Cal repurposed some old tack shelves and moved them to the back of the what Viv now thought of as a storefront. He also managed to replace some cracked panes in the mullioned front window next to the smaller door. "Well, doesn't look much like a stable anymore," observed Viv, watching him fit in the last piece of glass. Mighty pleased, it quite smelling like one too." One afternoon, Viv returned from the cooper with a water barrel on one shoulder and a few buckets in hand. She took the barrel in the corner back of the counter. She drew water from the well a few blocks down, and Cal checked for leaks as she filled it. They converted the back room of the office to a pantry with more shelves. Viv consulted her notes, excavated a pit that she insulated with clay for cold storage. Cal added a neat hinged door. Viv did the latter work of whitewashing the front, while Cal re-inked mortar between the river stones low on the walls. When she strode back inside, the arming sweat from her forehead, and hauling the whitewash bucket, she found him inspecting the flagstones, checking the sand between. Her eyes went to the resting place of the scalvered stone. She had to keep herself from rushing forward to interrupt. "Anything need doing there?" she asked, trying to sound brisk and natural about it. What if he found the stone? Would he recognize it? And so what if he did? It was fair to say she trusted Cal, and yet... He looked up. Maybe a little more sand. This one's loose. Might should take it up to the pack some underneath. He stomped on the flag she'd buried the stone under, and her heart leaped. "I'll take care of it," she said, and her smile felt entirely false. Cal didn't seem to notice. He said. And that was that. Later that evening, after glances up and down the street to reassure herself that the man with the hat wasn't peering in at her, Viv did take up the flagstone. She removed the scalvered stone and held it in her hand, warm to the touch. It almost seemed to have the lambent yellow glow, independent of the light of the lantern. Replacing it with care, she scooped fistfuls of dirt to re-level the flagstone and smooth sand into the crevices again. That night she dreamed of the Scalvert Queen. But when she drove her hand into its skull to remove the stone, its flesh drew tight around her wrist. As she tried to withdraw her fist, she couldn't, and the flesh firmed. The Scalvert's many eyes ignited one by one like signal flares and fires into the dark. Her efforts to free herself grew increasingly frantic until she startled awake. The nerves in her right arm were alight, her hand tilling it with pins and needles. After lying awake for some time, she finally slept again, and by morning she'd forgotten the dream. Days passed in a haze of hot work, aching muscles, slivers, dust, and smells of sweat and lime and fresh cut wood. At the end of 2 weeks, the place looked downright respectable. Viv found herself out in the street a few times a day, hands in our hips, surveying the shop with a rising warm sense of accomplishment. On one of these occasions, she was startled to find Lainey suddenly beside her. The woman used her broom as a walking stick, leaning her weight on it. Viv had no idea how she'd arrived so silently. "Well, fanciest livery I've ever seen," Lainey said, and then nodded and went back to her porch. Unsure why she hadn't done it sooner, Viv set up the ladder and tore down the old Parkins livery sign, tossing it to the rubbish pile with real satisfaction. "Going to need a new sign," said Cal, his thumbs hooked into the waist of his breeches, staring up at the vacant iron bracket. "You know," Viv said, "I took a lot of notes. Figured I'd cover most details, but I never really thought about a sign. Or a name." She looked down at Cal. "Just never crossed my mind." It was quiet for a minute. Then Cal cleared his throat, and in the most hesitant voice he'd ever heard from him, he ventured, "Viv's place." "Good as any, I suppose," she replied. "I don't have a better idea." He didn't look satisfied. Maybe Maybe Viv's coffee. I'll be honest. Feels strange having my name on anything. Like putting your own face on the sign. A pause. Could you say coffee, I suppose? Don't expect there'll be a lot of confusion. Viv squinted hard at him and thought he'd outlast her, but then his mouth quirked at the corner. I figure I'll table it for now, she said. Who knows, maybe I'll name it after you. Calamity Coffee. Has a nice sound to it. Cal regarded her, sniffed, and then said solemnly, Well, you're not wrong. Later that week, the bulk of construction was complete. They built a big trestle table and benches ran between the booths. She and Cal stained and oiled them all, swept the floors clean, and set glass in the new high windows. Viv hoisted a chandelier and secured it to the bolt plate. Cal set into the wall. As an evening drew on, they lit it with a long taper, both pleased with the glow it cast, the ring shadow pulsing below. At the table, with Viv's notes between them, they discussed some of the finer points of furnishings and rugs, maybe some neat reeds to freshen the smell of the place. They both halted their conversation at once. In the doorway stood the man in the hat. With company to boot, they were less well dressed, a motley assortment of men, 2 humans and a dwarf with a crumpled beard and clubbed back hair. Viv saw at least 2 short swords and would have wagered there was at least 6 knives between them, one cuff or other. Wondered when you stopped back by, said Viv. She didn't bother to rise. I'm flattered to have occupied your thoughts, the man said, stepping across the threshold and surveying the renovations with appreciation nod. You've been mightily industrious. The old place never looked better. Seems you won't be in the business of horseflesh, though. Viv shrugged. His smile from the last visit might never have lapsed in all the intervening days. Look, I enjoy the witty back and forth as much as the next man, but I sense you appreciate directness. I'm merely a representative. My friends call me Lack. You can too. This street, this entire southern quarter is under the watchful and benefit eye of the Madrigal. He sketched a bow, as though the Madrigal himself were here to see it. You think I need a watchful eye? Viv's brows rose. We all need someone to watch out for us, replied Lack. This is the part where you let me know about the monthly involuntary donation for, what did you call it? A beneficent eye? Lack cocked a finger at her, and his smile widened. Well, you said your piece, Viv casually dismissed him by, returning to the study of her notes. Cal hadn't budged an inch during the entire exchange, his face rigid. Lack's voice developed an annoyed edge. I'll expect your contribution end of the month. 1 sovereign, 2 silvers is the going rate. What you expect is your business. Viv's reply was mild. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the heavies behind Lack make a move to approach, which had been a laughable mistake, but he stopped them with a gesture. There was a heavy silence while Viv waited for a rebuttal. Then Lack and his crew were gone. Cal let out a long breath and shot her a word glance. Listen, you don't want to run afoul with the Madrigal, he said in a soft voice. When the hob normally spoke, it was always even and solid like he was a laying brick. They changed it and made her look at him seriously. That's what Lainey said. She put one of her hands on the table and opened it wide. But Cal, I think you have a pretty good idea of what these hands have done. You really see me bobbing a curtsy to a bunch of men too stupid to know the odds they were to tangle with me? I don't doubt you laid those 4 low, no problem, but listen. There's a lot more than 4 of them out there, and the Madrigal is the sort to make an example. I've heard a lot of stories of legends in my time, and they're always worse than the real thing. I can take care of myself here. Maybe so. This place, though, he rapped the table with a knuckle, it ain't fireproof. So fine, you can take care of yourself, but I fear there's more you got stake in. Am I wrong? Viv frowned and stared at him, lost for words. Cal got up, leveled a finger at her and said, Wait. He rummaged in some of the last remaining supplies and retrieved a hammer and nail. Up on his toes, at the wall behind the counter, he banged some brackets in the wood. 1, 2, 3. At least do this. Put that sword of yours up there, he said. If you're going to show him you got teeth, at least fix it so you can bite when you need them. When Viv retired for the night, black blood rested on those brackets, a killing slab. She wished it was still hidden in the corner. Viv hadn't expected Cal, but around noon he showed up, riding in the back of a cart next to a big black stove and several lengths of stovepipe. She gave him the side eye as he leapt down. What's all this? He shrugged. I said you need a kitchen, and before you say anything, it's already paid for. She tossed up her hands, both amused and exasperated. The horses shied nervously. Where'd you get this? I'm not a beggar. He gestured at the upper room. Gets cold there here in the winter and no fireplace to speak of. You want to freeze up there in the loft, laying on the floor, snow on the roof? Give me a hand with this. Viv held her peace as she hefted the stove out of the wagon, one end of a time. Even for her, the heavy iron thing was difficult to maneuver. She eventually got it down and walked it by the end into the storefront, by way of the big doors. Cal carried in the stovepipe, piece by piece, and then paid the impatient driver. She was surprised to find that she was a little winded. Her back was gnawing at her again, too, as she fell onto one of the benches. Can't let you pay for it, Cal. Too bad. Already paid me too much. Figured it was going to waste it on something foolish. This might well be it. Heat for winter, huh? Cal nodded. And if the bean water doesn't work out? Viv laughed. Speaking of that, she gestured at the counter where the mortar and pestle sat next to a few kettles, a tumble of cloth, and some fired clay cups. Take it up apothecary, too. I'll show you. Let's get this thing out of the middle of the floor first. At some direction from Cal, she positioned the stove against the west wall, and after some fearing and fussing and cursing, she got the stovepipe fixed. With a little cutting by brace drill and saw, and some arch comments from Viv, he fed the pipe out through the flange where it met the wall. A few hours later, they had their end run up past the eaves and topped with a rain cap. They made the do that with some scrap kindling and started a small blaze inside the box. The smoke drew up and out just fine. All right, said Viv. Get some water in one of those kettles and put it on. Cal raised his eyebrows. Bean water? You want to test the stove or not? He shrugged and went about it, filling the kettle from the water barrel. Viv dug out a handful of coffee beans from one of the sacks, crushed them in the mortar, and poured the grounds into a tube of linen. She sketched the two over the mouth of one of the clay cups. When the kettle whistled, she slowly poured boiling water through, a little at a time. Is that a lady's stocking? Asked Cal. Viv glanced at him. It's clean. I don't wear stockings. Just asking, he said mildly. She said. It seemed as if he was rubbing off on her. How exactly were you planning on to use that kettle with no stove? He asked pointedly. Needed to fill the machine that's coming. Just a happy accident. Viv completed the last sparkling pour, waited for the swollen grounds to steep. Removing the linen sleeve and swirling the cup, she closed her eyes, brought it to her nose, and inhaled deeply. She took an experimental taste and smiled, nodding. That's enough, not half bad. Cal frowned at her. No, she said defensively. This isn't as good as it'll be when I can make it right. But she handed him the cup. He made a big show of sniffing at it. He raised his eyebrows and nodded a little. Very slowly and very delicately, he sipped at it, and then he held it in his hands and stood there. After what Viv considered an overly generous few moments, she couldn't help herself. Well, said Cal. I'll allow. It's actually not that terrible. Later they sat at the big table, each with their own cup. Cal pretended to ignore his, but Viv caught him stealing cautious sips. Now and then, and when he thought she wasn't looking, she held it in both hands contemplatively, absorbing the heat and the scent. It felt like completing a loop, like a satisfying click of clasps snapping closed. So, she said, you can also make these with milk. You might like it. Milk? Cal made a face. Better than it sounds. You have to try it once to have the machine. The gnomes called it a latte. Named after the gnomish barista who invented them. I think latte diameter? Cal gave her a long-suffering look. Can't explain that one word means with another word nobody knows. What's a barista? Cal, I didn't invent the words. Folks gonna need a new education just to buy some bean with some coffee. I don't know, I kind of like it. It's more exotic that way. Ladies' stockings and exotic bean water. God's help us. Chapter 5. The jobs board sat at the east end of the largest square in Thun. It was long and low, and beneath newer scraps of parchment, or full scraps, furred with the ragged flakes of 100 others. As if scanned the notices, she endured a weary onrush of memory, beast hunts, bounties, and battles. She might have torn down 5 score of those sheets herself in one city or another. Knuckles bloodied to claim her due to a job done. She'd even posted a few in her time. A hireling here, filling out a hunting party there. This one was nothing like the others. She spiked her notice on one of the many iron studs and read over what she'd written. Assistant wanted, but must be willing to learn. Management and food service experience desired. Advancement opportunities. Patience a plus. Wages commensurate. Inquire at the old livery on the Redstone afternoon to dusk. It was a long shot, but the Scoured Stone hadn't let her down yet. She returned to the shop but found herself restless, pacing. She sent post for her most important delivery on her first day in the city. While the coffee had shown up promptly, the other parcel had yet to arrive. With the shop repaired and cleaned and nothing upon which to expend her nervous energy, she felt thwarted. After weeks of steady work and with Cal absent, her hands itched with the inactivity. At last, in exasperation, she gathered her notes into her satchel and hiked to the pub she visited on her first night in Thune. She sat at the table in the back, ordered a meal, and made increasingly irrelevant list. When noon arrived, her meal remained half-eaten, and her nervous organizational efforts were in shambles. So she lunged from her seat, paid, and stalked back to the shop to wait. The idea that an applicant would arrive on the first day was of course ludicrous, but the Scoured Stone, well, she either trusted its power or she didn't, and if she did, the Scoured Stone of Fire draws the ring of fortune. Viv started a fire, boiled water, ground some beans, made a cup of coffee, which she drank too quickly. Then she made another, and another. As a result, she was nervier than ever, and wished she'd written other instructions on the advertisement. But that her probably misplaced faith in the power of the stone wasn't keeping her quarreled there. Did she really believe it would deliver results so soon? Black blood hung ominously on the wall. She found herself waiting to take it down to sharpen it and lose herself in the repetitive, familiar action of it. But she forced her gaze away. She found herself annoyed that Cal had made her hang it up, and then angry at herself for blaming him. Since was that stupid to think? Viv could have juggled the man one-handed. He'd hardly made her do anything. Then in the late mid-afternoon, there was a rap on the door, and opened briskly. A woman strode in, glancing about in a way that both cautious and confident. She was tall, not as tall as Viv, one of course with glossy black hair, cut severely at chin length. She wore breeches and what looked like a sweater, dark and shapeless with a collar that covered her throat. Her face was aristocratic, her eyes dark. Viv also noted with a surprise the short stubs of horns parting her hair, the hint of dusty magenta in her skin, and her whipcord tail. The woman was clearly succubus. Viv's head was already buzzing from her fourth cup of coffee. She started up from her seat. The woman slowly looked her up and down, but her expression didn't change. She glanced deliberately at black blood on the wall and then back. "Assistant wanted?" she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was throaty, but she spoke precisely. That's right," replied Viv, and then just stood there. The woman's eyebrows slowly rose, and then she closed the door behind her. She held out her hand. "Tanjri," she said. "Viv," she said awkwardly, returned the handshake, cursing herself for drinking so much coffee. "I'm sorry, I didn't expect anyone to actually show up on the first day," she said. Which was absolutely untrue, but seemed a good excuse for how scattered she probably appeared. "I like to be prompt," said Tanjri. Good. Viv tried to get a hold of herself. She'd hired help before. Sure, they'd been mercenaries and cut purses, but the principle was the same. Lay out the job, set forth the terms, get a feeling for whether they'd cut and run at an inconvenient moment, and then make the call. Easy. So I'm looking for an assistant. I guess it's clear from the notes the job's a sort of a... You ever hear of coffee? The succubus shook her head, her hair moving like a liquid curtain. I have not. Well, it's fine. Doesn't matter. Tea, though? You know, tea. Opening this shop soon. Kind of like a tea shop, but coffee. Can't run it all by myself, but I need somebody willing to learn the work, take customers, help with whatever needs doing. Probably some cleaning, too, and then they'd make coffee, you know, as needed after some instruction from me. I wrote food service experience in the notice. You have that? Tanjri's expression didn't falter in the slightest. I do not. The succubus inclined her head at Viv. Do you? Viv's mouth hung open for a moment until she eventually managed. I do not. I am willing to learn. That was higher up on the notice, said the woman. That's true, Viv scratched the back of her head. Gods, this was so awkward. Advancement opportunities, it also said, prompted Tanjri. What sort of opportunities? I did that right, that, didn't I? Well, I mean, things went well. I guess it would depend on what your interests were. There was a very awkward pause. Viv wrestled with what she was about to say. She'd never been skilled at putting things delicately. It had never been particularly important up until now. Succubi had a reputation for certain biological imperatives. Were their needs and particulations even a choice? She forged onward. You're a succubus, right? The implied addendum to the question, Tandri's expression changed for the first time. A pinching of the lips, a tightening around the eyes, her tail lashing behind her. I am, and you're an orc. Running a not tea shop. No judgment from me, Viv babbled, feeling on the precipice of a great mistake, but stumbling forward nevertheless. I only ask because, no. I have no desire to vamp your customers, if that's your question. Tandri's voice was icy. That wasn't what I was planning to say, said Viv. I would never assume that. I've just never worked with one of you. I wasn't sure about your needs. Gods, this was agonizing. Her cheeks were aflame. Tandri closed her eyes and crossed her arms in front of her. Her cheeks were flushed as well. Viv was absolutely sure she was about to turn on her heel and leave. She sighed. I apologize. Look, I'm very bad at this. I don't really know what I'm doing. She hooked a thumb at the great sword on the wall. This is what I know and what I've always known. I just want to know something else now. To be something else. Everything I said was stupid. Of all people, ought to know better than to assume anything based on what you were born as. Before you walk out, do you mind if I start over? Tandri took a slow breath in through her nose, out through her mouth. There's no need to start over. Ah, said Viv, disappointed. I understand. Why waste the time? We've covered most of the particulars, continued the succubus briskly. So wages commensurate. Viv goggled at her for a moment and stammered. 3 silver, 8 bars, bits a week to start. 4 silver? Yes, that's fine. Acceptable. Then you want the job? I do. Tandri held out her hand again. Viv shook it in a daze. Well then, welcome aboard. Thanks. She'd out to hire an assistant, but she had the overwhelming sense that she just acquired a partner without meaning to. She couldn't help wondering who had interviewed whom. It's settled then, said Tandri. Pleasure to meet you, Viv. She then turned and left, closing the door gently behind her. Patience a plus, Viv murmured. It was several minutes before she noticed that she hadn't even specified when the work would start, but somehow she wasn't worried about it. Viv went directly to the square and tore down her notice, which hadn't hung for more than 7 hours. She folded it and tucked it into a pocket, then returned to the shop, where she wiped away the debris of her furtive bean grinding. Afterward, Viv went out and ate a hearty meal, coming home pleasantly warm and full. She sat toying with the witching rod in the dining area, her gaze returned again and again to the place where the scoured stone rested. Later, staring at the ceiling from her bedroll, she thought about her impending delivery and the feeling potential motion building in her. All that remained was for that last obstruction to be kicked away. She heard a thud on the roof tiles, heavy footfalls clattering noisily as something large tracked to the western wall. There was a pregnant pause, and then a thump. Viv quietly stole from her bedroll, descended the ladder, placed a dark and quiet street, trying to see on the roof before checking the alley to the west. But she found nothing. All right. We're going to end it there for now. We're going to be on chapter 6. So we actually managed 3 chapters today, which is good. I appreciate anybody who listens, and hopefully I upload again soon. Maybe we continue this story. Thank you.